the New York State GIS Association webinar titled Crafting Effective Visual Presentations. My name is Ann Deacon, and I am a member of the association's Professional Development Committee, and am a member of the Department of Geology and Environmental Sciences at the State University of New York at Fredonia. Before introducing our presenter, I wanted to thank Lisa Melahusky of our online learning office for her help with the logistics for today's webinar. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Dr. Tracy Marafiote. Dr. Marafiote is a colleague of mine from Fredonia's Department of Communication. She's been on the faculty here at Fredonia for 10 years and teaches in the area of communication studies. Her undergraduate and master's degrees are from the University of South Florida, and her PhD is from the University of Utah. Dr. Marafiote's research is focused on environmental communication as it relates to gender, race, and class. And I have to tell you that working with Tracy over the last several weeks to plan this webinar has already inspired me to rethink my slides and the way I present them. And I'm sure she will do the same for you. Tracy?
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. I want to start off thanking, as Ann did, I want to thank Lisa Melahusky for her help. And Garvis, thank you very much. I feel like we've sort of met, even though I have no idea what you look like. And thanks very much to Ann for everything that she has done to facilitate this presentation. As she said, I am Tracy Marafiote. I'm in the Communication Studies program here at Fredonia. And I have focused on presentation skills since my master's program, since the very first day of teaching as a master's student when I walked into a public speaking classroom. Now, visuals have changed considerably since that long ago day. That was before PowerPoint. In fact, it was before most people even had email. But the basics and the foundational elements of strong presentations have really generally stayed consistent. So to let me understand where you all are coming from, I'm going to ask you to type in just one word that describes how you feel about preparing for and giving presentations. And I'm going to stay silent for 15 seconds or so while you do that, if you would just type in one word. All right, seeing a bunch of responses, terrific. We'll wait for a few more. Okay, so I'm really pleased to see some really positive ones. There were only a few that identified things like stressed or fearful or panicked, that sort of thing. And there were actually more than I had expected that said words like excited. There were nothing that said joyous or energized, but hopefully we can kind of move in that direction. So none of these are terribly surprising or unusual. But if this is you when you are preparing for a presentation at all, we're hopefully going to help you to move beyond that and feel a lot more confident in your presentations. We will help you get past that. So now I'm going to ask you to another question. This is a rhetorical one, but I do want you to consider your responses. When you think about giving a presentation, what are your general goals? Pretty commonly, I'm confident that they would fit into one of these categories. They would fit into conveying information. Oh, my slide forwarding is not working. Staging. No, we're stuff. Sorry, folks. Just 1 minute, please. One thing that we had not anticipated. It could be that's all right. It'll work. Yeah. Probably the shift from I use a PC to a Mac. That may be it. So something we're going to talk about a little bit later is animation. That may cause some problems for that section, but we'll make it work out. So I'll tell you when things are supposed to be animated. So what my intention here was to do was to first show you, right, this idea of conveying information. The second one, maintaining your audience interest. And then the third one, of course, is going to be creating a professional, credible standing within your field. Pretty much any of your goals are going to fall into one of those categories. And so let's take a look at our roadmap. And we're going to touch on all three of those goals as we go through these three general areas of an effective presentation. We're going to walk through thinking about your audience and the context of your presentation. We're going to talk about the content. That's where we're going to spend most of our time and a lot of detail there. And then we'll touch a little bit on delivery toward the end. Now, before we talk about the elements of audience and context, I want to clarify that I'm working from the assumption that most of you are here because you're interested in presenting your work and yourself at academic conferences. Now, even if this is not necessarily the case for you, I want to emphasize that nearly all of the information here is going to be equally relevant for if you're talking about a classroom slide presentation or lecture, if you're talking about on-campus research talks with colleagues, maybe giving a report to administration, or if you're doing an off-campus presentation in the community. All of the tips that we're going to talk about here are going to be equally relevant in creating effective PowerPoint presentation or other slide format presentation. So when preparing for any presentation, it really is worth it to take a little bit of time to consider the context of your presentation and the goals of your presentation, and what are your specific audience's needs and their expectations to make sure that you are right on target with those. What are you going to include? What are you going to leave out? How should you organize the information? How should you format that information? Those are going to be, all of those questions are going to be driven by what is it that your audience wants to hear, and what is the expected formula in your field. Now that's, again, especially true for academic conference presentations. So certainly in many fields, there's going to be an expectation of a brief. Please keep it brief, maybe a literature review or mentioning your theoretical framework or your methodology and so on. So do ask around and find out what the norms and expectations are in your specific field. And remember though, regardless of those things, your audience is there to learn about your information that you have to share, your central points, your contributions. So I'm getting ahead of myself there. So this is your choice, your option to share your new information, to demonstrate your expertise, and to use a format that is going to present that in a way that is meaningful and organized. So now the question is, how do we best share those? This question is the reason for this presentation. Obviously, we're going to look at quite a few factors demonstrated to that. But first, let's think for just 1 minute about the tools that you are using. Now, choosing your presentation tools or your slide software can be really difficult because there are so many options. So consider again your goals for the presentation, and from there determine what presentation or slide tool or slide software is going to make most sense to use. So I'm using PowerPoint. A lot of people really hate PowerPoint, and I understand why, because it has been used and abused terribly in the past. But I use it because it is something that I'm comfortable with. It's simple to use. It's very clear for the audience, and it fits my particular style, my goals. This is what you should be striving for in your specific choices. What are you comfortable with? What can make your information clear? And what is your specific style? So I've seen all kinds of different slide presentations work really well and work really poorly. What matters, I think, more than the slide tool that you're using is what you're doing with it. So let's move on to take a look at the content of your presentation. Of the 3 sections of the presentation, as I mentioned, this is going to be the most content dense. So let's unpack these key components. In this section, we're going to talk about the text, what is actually on your slide. We're going to look at some visuals and animation, and we're going to look at then at font and color use. How are we going to craft effective slides that are going to be in terms of both your information and your aesthetics? So again, before we get started further on this section, I want to take a quick poll. What would you say is the primary purpose of presentation tools or slides. And I'm going to stay silent again for a few seconds while you type in the underlined word that represents your choice. Would you say that the primary point is to entertain the audience, to keep them interested? Is it to repeat spoken information? Is it to supplement spoken information? Or is it to distract the audience from looking at you while you're speaking? That's it. Excuse me one moment. While you're typing that, I'm going to talk with Ann for one moment. Okay, so I see a lot of people writing. All right, terrific. Thank you for that feedback. Great. So we're going to discuss that that best response in just a minute. All right, so this is the section on text. As you know from your own writing, clarity and organization of your information, it's absolutely essential to conveying it effectively to your audience, to your reader, to your listener, whoever it is that you are targeting. So the format of sharing information in any channel, whether it is a public speech, a news article, an essay for a course, is generally the same. Tell your audience what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you just told them. And you've probably heard some version of this at some point, especially if you ever took a public speaking course. Now, while your slides should follow this general format, it's a mistake that many people make is thinking of their slides as their primary channel for conveying their information. It's not. So let's go back and look at your responses to your presentation, or to the poll question that I asked. I'm going to emphasize here that I cannot do the animation that makes bold the okay, well, that's better. All right, thank you. I cannot do any of the animation, so I'm going to have to tell you what the options are. But a slide presentation should always be secondary. Its primary goal is to supplement what the speaker is saying, what it is that you are conveying to the audience verbally. Now, some of you said that it might be to repeat, and I can see that that makes a lot of sense too. Now, we do want to entertain the audience, in the sense that we want to keep them interested, but that's not the primary goal. And certainly, I hope you're not looking for it to distract the audience. So, excuse me, the most common mistake that I see on slides is simply too much information. So much that it potentially even overwhelms what it is that the speaker, who is the primary channel for the information, what it is that the speaker is saying. So let's take a look at a few examples. Fortunately, this sort of word dump isn't that common anymore, but it does happen. This is not a useful slide. It actually acts as a barrier, or an obstacle between the presenter and the audience. Unfortunately, it sends the message to the audience that the speaker doesn't actually want to present. They want the audience to read the information, so they don't have to stand there and talk with them and relate to the audience. So this is kind of an obstacle that we don't want to have. Let's take a look at another example. Now, this slide makes more of an effort at clarity by separating the ideas into bullet points, which is terrific. Unfortunately, though, it is still cluttered. It's too much writing, which is still distracting because it still invites the audience to read the information rather than listen to the speaker. What we're aiming for is this idea. As I tell my students, if all of your information is on your slides, why does the audience need you? You want your audience to need you. And unfortunately, it's not uncommon to see someone with a slide full of text whose speaking content doesn't actually even match what's written. In that case, they're telling their audience that they need to pay attention either to what is being said or what is written on the slide, because your audience cannot pay attention to both. You've probably been in that situation where you've been trying to read somebody's slide and listen to them at the same time. And as much as we think we're good at multitasking, we know that we can't actually do that. So your words should always parallel your slide content. You want to make sure that, again, that you're not trying to get your audience, you're not making your audience choose between listening to you and figuring out what's on your slide and how it connects to what it is that you're saying. So let's look at a better example. This is simple, it's concise, it's uncluttered, it reinforces the primary ideas, and I'm going to talk about those primary ideas in just a moment, while encouraging the audience to actually listen to you. Now I'm going to talk about this terrible slide design and a little bit below, but this, in terms of the text, is this sleek and concise structure really is the goal that we are going for. You want to avoid wordiness on your slides. Use, as it says here, you want to use your keywords or your phrases only. Fill in the rest verbally. You want to write out your information in bullet point form, not in complete sentences that contain every detail. You can fill in those details in the words that you are saying. You also want to make sure that you're creating your bullet points in a parallel structure. So what does that mean? This is an example of non-parallel structure. What's happening here is that we're combining descriptive and action phrases, like present keywords and phrases with a description parallel structure, telling you to always do something and telling you to use something. So if we go back and look at this previous one, right, we can see that these are presented with a parallel structure, the same format for each one of the bullet points. So I talked about the first 2 points on the slide, and I want to talk about the last 2. I want to do that actually in reverse order. So you might be thinking, the last one says to use 1 to 2 slides per minute, and you might be thinking, it seems like she's using a little bit more than 1 to 2 slides per minute. And you're right, I absolutely am. And this is one of those cases where the rules differ for using a webinar, because I can't interact with you. I cannot create a connection with you. I can't even see if you're actually really there. Now, for that reason, webinar presenters are typically going to use at least twice as many slides, because we're relying more on the slides to do some of the work of engaging the audience. So even though I requested this video component so that you can see me, I still need to get some connection with you, and I'm relying on the slides a little bit more than I typically would to accomplish that. Now, the previous point, always use 6 points or less per slide, preferably fewer. The layout of a slide is as important as the text that's on it. So how you arrange or organize your information affects how it's going to be perceived by the audience. So this slide texture, this slide rule of not more than 6 points per slide is there for a good reason. Why less than 6 lines? It's hard. Sometimes it's so hard to limit it. I completely understand that. Sometimes we just want to provide all these really important details. Right here, for instance, this is a detailed outline of the content of this talk. Now, I think this is all really important. Otherwise, I would not have included it, right? The questions are, do you need, as the audience, do you need to know all of this at once? Would you comprehend all of it? In 15 seconds, I would typically have this slide up. Would you remember all of it, even if I did keep it up there? And the answer to all 3 of those questions is no, probably not. So when you're creating slides, for the most part, you want to leave out your subpoints and your sublists. To borrow from the author and presenter Gar Reynolds, this slide that you're looking at, this isn't a visual aid. It's actually an eye chart. All right, so why 6 lines? Well, let's condense this a little bit more. Even this, I've gotten rid of some of those subpoints, but even this is really too much and unnecessary. So what do we do this? Then we identify the key points, the primary things that I want to make sure that you take away. That we're talking about audience and context, we're talking about the content, we're talking about delivery. If people can keep the key points in their heads, they're more likely to be able to then organize some of the information that's related to it. And if you have just your key points in your slides, you have then the option subsequently to fill things in verbally or to elaborate on them with subsequent slides if that's what you decide is important enough to do. All right, so let's take a few minutes to talk about visuals and animations. So we're having a little bit of difficulty here because we lost the animations for my slide software when it was uploaded to this Mac, as I had mentioned earlier. But I'm going to try to talk you through a little bit, and we'll see how it works. And we can still talk about some of the rules for using those and how those work effectively. I want for you to recognize that visuals aren't just about having something for your audience to look at. Remember, the goal is not just to entertain your audience. Visuals should bring added depth to a presentation. They should bring additional meaning to the presentation. They should have some informative power in and of themselves. And used really well, they can accomplish all of those things. So why use visuals? Again, this is one of those places where you're supposed to just see the center, and then each one of these would come up individually, but that's okay. We can talk about those. Let's start off with the idea of immediate reaction. Visuals create an immediate reaction with viewers. The words take a lot longer for people to process. They allow you to represent your ideas through multiple senses. People are not just hearing you say something, they're seeing it, and then they're reinforcing it through the connection of what the image represents and how it reflects and relates to the text that you're actually using. This aids people's memory and retention of your information. Next, they provide variation in your slide format. This is going to increase audience engagement and interest because you don't want to have the same format slide time after time after time. We want to have a little bit of variation. Next, they help your audience to focus on the key concepts. Right, because of some of the previous things that we talked about, reinforcing that information, reinforcing the idea that this is something that is important enough that I have an image of it, something that I want for you to take a look at. Again, this helps people to remember the key information that you want to present to them. And finally, not at all least, is emotional appeal. All of these factors, all of these 5 factors are going to strengthen your presentation. So let's talk a little bit more about this idea of emotional appeal. This one reinforces all of the others: the immediate reaction, multiple senses, engagement and interest, memory and retention. So what might emotional appeal look like in terms of using an image in a slide? This is a slide that was created by a communication designer for TED Talks, Aaron Weinberg. It was created for a presentation on preparing for worst case scenarios. Can you think of a more perfect image? This so perfectly captures the sentiment and instantly evokes this kind of emotional reaction to crisis, which is exactly what he wants the audience to get out of his presentation. Another example are these 2 slides. Now, these really successfully demonstrate the difference between text only on one hand and an image with text on the other hand, as opposed to just stating the fact in the first one, which is a good fact and is an important fact. Right? Happily no longer the case, right? But it's an important fact. But the one on the left makes much more real and present the importance, the significance of that statistic, because we have a visual expression of what that actually might mean for a place that is experiencing drought. So visuals are going to do a lot more than just support your message. They enhance audience comprehension, they enhance retention, and they elicit an emotional response that increases the impact of your message. So that's going to bring us to the next question. So I've been emphasizing, you want to make sure that you have these visuals. This is how important they are. This is how much they're going to reinforce and strengthen the message that you're trying to get across. But how do you choose a good image? What makes a good image? This is a really difficult one. So if we look at it just from terms of production value, you want to make sure that you have something that is a high resolution so that when you put it on your slide and you show it to your audience, especially in the case of a classroom or something where you have a slide, I keep using this hand and I realize it's not on the screen, but if you have a slide that's projected behind you, you want to make sure that it's not going to be pixelated. You want to make sure that it's adequate size for what it is that you need and that you're representing it well enough that the audience can see it. And you want to make sure that it's professional looking. Does it have professional composition in terms of lighting, contrast, the use of color, all of those sorts of things? And finally, you want to make sure that it's not going to be distorted, that you are representing it in a way that is actually appropriate. You know, you don't have somebody stretched out really wide or really tall. All right. So these are the production values of a good image, but that doesn't really do much to tell us what is going to be catchy, what's going to be useful for some of those other things like the emotional appeal that we were looking for. So a good image in terms of presentation enhancement should do two primary things. First of all, image uniqueness. Does this image stand out? Does it get noticed by your audience? This is so important, and sometimes it's really difficult to describe what is going to make a good image, what is going to catch people's attention, and that is going to be true for everyone. But you can tell the difference when you're looking through slides, and we'll talk about where to find some of those in just a minute. You can tell the difference between a slide or an image that's really similar to all of these other possible images that you have an option, or something that just stands out to you. It seems unique, it seems a little bit different. So this is really important. But uniqueness will only be a distraction if it doesn't also have relevance. So this image has to not only be unique, but you want to make sure that it supports and reinforces your key point or the message that you're trying to convey on that particular slide. So as implied by all of these characteristics, the ones related to the production value and the ones related to presentation enhancement, all images are not created equal. Clipart. Please reconsider your use of clipart. It's terribly outdated, and it really will make your presentations appear old school. You're better off truly with no images at all than to have your audience think that you are not current, you're not contemporary. Especially when there are so many fantastic images that are so easily accessible. There's no need to use clip art. So here's a presentation. If you're thinking about creating something new, and you're creating a slide presentation, so you're creating something new, consider all of your options. Why would you offer the one on the left when you have the opportunity to create something like the one on, left and right is way I'm looking at is left and right to you too. Mm-hmm. Okay. Not sure if I'm turned around a little bit there. All right, so why would you create the one with the clip art when you can create one that is more streamlined, more clean, more professional, and contemporary looking? All right, so I'm telling you all these guidelines, but where do you find these images? Well, you've got a couple different options. The internet. The internet is an incredible tool that we have access to. Online searches, whether you use Google or Bing or whatever search engine it is that you want to use, type in image and then some characteristics, and you're going to come up with all kinds of incredible options. Stock photos are also a great way of finding images that we're looking for. Many of them are free or low cost. Not all of them, some you do have to pay for, but maybe you have an institutional connection to it as well that you might use. But stock photos make it really simple to identify very, very specific descriptors for some specific image that you're looking for. You can type in mixed race athletes celebrating with champagne, and you'll come up with all kinds of multicultural groups of people in their athletic uniform with a bottle of champagne. Or you can type in woman laughing with salad, which is incredibly a thing, and there are lots of those kinds of images as well. Stock photos have it all, whatever you can think of. So they're a great option for finding images that may help demonstrate whatever idea it is that you want to get across. But the last one is an incredible tool. Because one drawback of stock photos is that many of them are ridiculously posed and really unnatural. By looking at Flickr, you're looking at, which is an online photo sharing site if you're not familiar with it. You're generally looking at more candid, natural, evocative images, because these are images that are taken by people, typically in natural settings. Now, there are a lot of professionals on there who post different things, but you have an incredible range. So while stock photos let you find images to your exact specifications, which is fantastic, what's especially cool to me about Flickr is that it's more creative and less obvious. These ideas might be generated because people's labeling sometimes, if they're personal images, are a little bit unusual or unexpected. And so they might pull up these unusual or unexpected images, which can give you some terrific ideas and things you might not have come up with on your own. So if you go to Flickr, again, this is a photo sharing site and it's spelled just like it is on the slide. This is not a typo. You want to look for the advanced search settings and all Creative Commons. And the Creative Commons means images that are set so that anybody can access them. There are others that are limited. You have to belong to a group or pay for them or what have you. But if you look for the all Creative Commons on Flickr, you'll be able to access all of those images, which is pretty terrific. Excuse me. Okay. So I'm going to do another quick poll. This is just a yes or no. Do you generally use charts or graphs in your work that are likely to end up in your presentation? So again, if you would just type in a quick yes if you do generally use charts or graphs in your work, or no if you don't generally use charts and graphs in your work. Okay. All right, it appears that the people who've responded, it appears that most people are saying yes, we do. And this was sort of what I expected. So in this section, we want to focus on, or up to this point, we focused on visuals that are photographs. But I want to take a look at charts and graphs because, as I suspected, it seems like many people are using those. But we're going to start with a foundational rule for charts and graphs. Now, I'm supposed to first show you this really complicated. Again, the animation was not working here, but you can look behind the text here, and you can see that it's a fairly, complicated statistical representation. At least it's complicated to somebody in the humanities. It may not be to you, but to me it is. So if you're not going to explain your chart or your graph, don't use it. It's incredibly distracting. If you're not going to explain its content, if you're not going to talk about why this chart or graph that you're showing is relevant to what it is that you're saying verbally, then get rid of it. Like most of the excess texts and things that we discussed earlier in those slides, you don't want to have your audience choosing whether to look at your slide and this chart or this graph and trying to figure out how it connects to what it is that you're saying, or choosing whether to listen to you. Those two things should go together and should enhance each other. So also, you want to avoid clutter. Now, yes, yikes, right? So even if this slide was explained one part at a time, this is just too much, right? So always ask yourself, how much detail do I absolutely need? Now, as presenters, we are all guilty of including too much data on our slides, right? Maybe too much on our charts, because it's our work. It's all important to us, right? We think that all of it is sheer brilliance because we created it. But again, the goal is to limit clutter, to limit the information to only the essential data, to the key goal of your specific presentation. You can't include everything. And by putting it on there and not talking about it, you're adding to the clutter and taking away from the message rather than enhancing that message. So for instance, this pie chart is really, really simple. That's part of the point. We're limiting it here to 4 to 6 slices. You want to make sure that the contrast represents things that are visible. This is not an ideal pie chart. I would like to see the percentage and the name, what it represents, actually in the same place. I didn't have that option on PowerPoint, and that is a real drawback for somebody who is going to use a lot of charts and graphs, that you have limited options for their chart tool or graph tool. Let's take a look also at a vertical bar chart. So again, this is really simple. You want to make sure that you're doing your best to limit it to 4 to 8 bars so it's not cluttered, there's not excess information there. And make sure that you're going to be talking about it. So I can't talk so much about a group reaching $98 million, but I could talk a lot about visual, verbal, and vocal, and those differences in how it is that people communicate and what forms of communication it is that people tend to use most in different situations. And so if I was going to be using a chart like this in a presentation, I would want to make sure to talk about, this is why it's important that the visual communication element is so much higher than the other elements, so that I'm not just leaving it up there for people to interpret themselves and figure out, why is this relevant to the content of this discussion. All right, so as I just said, always make sure that you're explaining the relevance of the information on the chart, and like a slide, you should supplement what you're saying verbally, not replace it, not divert from it. All right, so now we're going to move on to animations, and this section may be a little bit more difficult because I don't have the ability to do the animations on this slideshow, which is unfortunate, but we can work around that. So used well, animations can highlight or clarify information. It can emphasize points. It can demonstrate similarities or differences between concepts. If it's overused, though, it can distract and potentially annoy your audience. So you want to make sure that you're using it carefully. Now, from what I've seen in GIS slide presentations that Anne shared with me, your field tends to use quite a lot of different types of images. So we're going to look at a few slides that rely more on images than on text, and some of the complex connections between the images. So these next few slides are examples from a 2010 presentation on designing effective scientific talks by Sue McConnell, who is a biologist at Stanford University's Neuroscience Institute. She uses this first one as an example. There is a lot going on here in this slide. Too much going on in this slide. I think that you would probably agree. If the speaker is not going to discuss each part of this, then those parts should be deleted. But even if the speaker was to take time to explain each and every section of the slide, it's incredibly distracting. So what do? Well, separate them out. For instance, here you can see that one important element from that previous slide is broken out and given its own slide. Now, while I would generally use a different font, and we'll discuss fonts below, and it's probably a slightly different format, the difference between this and the previous slide is phenomenal. I also want to say that the use of fonts and those sorts of things, like anything else, those evolve. So this was from 2010, so that's something to keep in mind. I'm not critiquing Dr. McConnell. All right, this next slide adds, and this is not actually animation on the slide, so the reason this worked is these were two separate slides with a transition between them. So this uses a useful animation to add a layer of information from this previous, we see the surface view, to adding a side view. As does this one, gives us another view as well. So used judiciously, animation can really help to clarify complex concepts and relationships between different ideas. And this is what it is that we're aiming for. So another example that allows the speakers to explain one idea is something called a wipe transition. And again, this is a transition between two different slides, so this one should work as well. Okay, so we're looking at something in our body, and then we're looking at a highlight of it and a close-up of that image. And so this transition helps us to see the detail and allows the speaker to talk about it in a meaningful way without first presenting this slide, which might be distracting if they were just first trying to talk about the larger feature in and of itself. Okay, so when we're talking about animation, do demonstrate your relationships like we just showed you. You do want to use it to maintain audience focus. Now, how do we do this? Part of the way to do this is the reveal, and you've probably all seen this on slides where one line of text or one image is revealed. as the speaker is talking about it. And then the speaker talks about the next one, and that one is revealed. And then the next one is revealed as the speaker talks about it. And what this accomplishes is it allows the speaker to control what the audience is seeing and what they're being allowed to pay attention to. It prevents distractions on the part of the audience. It prevents people from reading ahead. And we've all been in those presentations where we're maybe not listening so much, and so we're reading ahead on the slides because there's lots of information there. I don't need the speaker. I'm just going to read ahead. Right? So limiting the amount of text is going to help present that, but also using animation to do that staged reveal will help keep the audience focused, help them to concentrate on what it is that you are trying to get across. Now, you do want to make sure, while this is really useful to use that staged animation and the slow reveal, don't do that on every single slide because it can get frustrating. In fact, you want to make sure you're not doing any one thing on every single slide in your presentation. Change it up, use variation, use images on one, use an animation on another one, so that people are engaged and it's maintaining their interest. They don't know what to expect from the next slide. So these are our do's. The next is our don'ts. Now, what you're not getting to see is some really fun animation that is available. The first one, using animation without a purpose. You don't want to do that. So for instance, I had this one bouncing in. It kind of hops in like a bunny, which is kind of fun if you're showing it to your toddler kid. But when you're talking to an adult audience, it's not something that is necessarily, it's not purposeful, and it doesn't add to your the meaning or the point that you're trying to make. It doesn't have the purpose of trying to focus the audience. You want to try not to use distracting animation. That one came in like a helicopter. You want to make sure you're not going overboard with your animation. The other one slid in from the side and then exploded, which is not necessary. And then the last thing to avoid doing is inconsistency. So when we're talking about consistency, you want to make sure always that you are being consistent across your slides. You're using the same background, the same color, the same font type, the same font size, and yes, same general animation style. Now this, again, doesn't mean doing the same thing on every single slide, right, which is going to put people to sleep, but it does mean having a general standard and then adding in variation for special effect or special goals or interest. All right, so let's move on to, looking at the time, let's move on to font and color. So real quickly, with typography, you want to make sure that we're looking for legibility over fun. We can use creative fonts like in the slide titles, but avoid using it in the text body. So we're going to stick to clean, traditional typefaces. For instance, you want to avoid serif fonts, and these are things like Times New Roman, or where it says serif fonts on the slide. They have the little doodads at that points or things that are enlarged. You want to stick to your standard non-serif fonts, and these are straight lines. They don't have a lot of extra things added to the letters to make them look fancier, and they're a lot cleaner, and they're a lot actually easier to read on presentations. You want to avoid capitalizing. Don't yell at your audience. And we've gotten to the point in the digital age where anybody writing in all caps, it's perceived as yelling. So you want to make sure that you're doing that. And we talked about the idea of consistency across font size, colors, and background slides. You also want to think about the size of your font. If you use a really small font, it's going to be more difficult for your audience to easily read. You want to make sure that if people are looking at this, maybe somebody is looking at this presentation on their phone, are they able to see and read what it is that I have written in terms of my text? Or if I'm presenting it in a classroom or an auditorium, sometimes you're not sure what the size of the room is you're going to be presenting in. You want to make sure that it's going to be easily readable from the back of the room. The minimum you should ever use would be a 24-point font. And you see slightly different standards depending on who the presenter is. But for a point of comparison, in this presentation, the headings are a 44-point font, and the text that I've used on each one of the slides has generally been a 32-point font. So let's look real quickly at the color. When you're choosing your color, you might use a very light font on a dark background or a very dark font on a light background to make sure that the distinction between the font, your writing, and your image is really legible, that people aren't struggling to read it. If you're using a medium colored font with a medium range color background, it can be very difficult to read, especially if you're in a classroom, for instance, where maybe there's sunlight streaming in the window or that sort of thing. It can be extremely distracting. I'm going to skip that one. Okay, I'm going to give you the super quick, down and dirty delivery notes so that we can move on to look at our time and on with our Q&A. Eye contact, what is valued, how it is valued, is very culturally driven. In the United States, generally, we think that eye contact, direct eye contact, conveys things like confidence, honesty, directness, reliability. So these are things that you want to look for. These are how we create a connection with another person, by having eye contact with that person. And so your goal in your presentation is going to be looking at every single person in the room at least once. Second, let's take a look at your body. Stance and postures. Are you standing up straight? Are you exuding confidence? When I do presentations with incoming students and I ask them, what do they think are the characteristic? Confidence is always one of the very first things that comes up. And the way that we stand is going to demonstrate confidence. It's going to allow us to relate to the audience in a way. We want to make sure that we're using natural gestures. And these are things that, ironically, the less you think about your hands, the more likely you are to use natural gestures. You can't see what I'm doing here, but you're not going to put your hands in your pockets, because if you put your hand in your pocket, it's going to lead you to do things like this. And that's really annoying and distracting. So use your hands to naturally, they're going to emphasize what it is that you're saying. That's just what our gestures tend to do. One thing I do want to talk about with the stance and posture before we move on is the power pose. How many of you are familiar with this? This is the Wonder Woman pose, right? Shoulders back, your hands on your hips. Now, obviously, you don't want to present that way. But one thing that I've found that's been really useful, and there's been some psychological studies on this, and some that have even potentially debunked it. There's been a little bit of a crisis in psychology lately. But it's the idea that what we do with our body can influence how we feel about ourselves. And regardless of whether some psychologists disagree with that, I firmly agree with it. So one of the ways that I feel is best to present is to picture yourself in that power pose. Picture yourself as that strong person. Have your shoulders back, have your strong and confident stance, and it's going to influence how it is that you relate to your audience. All right, last thing is your voice. Let's sum this up. Try not to talk too fast, too quietly, or in a monotone, because you'll put people to sleep. Did you get that? Try not to talk too fast, too quietly, or in a monotone. Use natural variation. Make sure that people can hear you without struggling, because if people have to try too hard to hear you, they're going to give up. Okay, your last tips. Practice. Make sure you don't go over your time limit. Practice. Be careful of using humor, because not everyone's humor is the same. First, make sure it's funny. You're going to tell a joke. Second, make sure it's relevant, because you don't want your audience to wonder why you're telling this joke if it has nothing to do with what you're talking about. And third, if there's any question about whether it's appropriate, don't use it, right? And if I haven't mentioned this already, practice. Okay, in closing, you have to have a strong closing. You need to have a conclusion slide. You can't just kind of stop talking, because people are going to wonder what happens. So this was our roadmap. We said we were going to talk about our audience and our context and our content and our delivery. And we did all three of those things. And that's what I want for you to take away from this, those three categories. And I can happily fill you in on any other details. Hopefully we took you from this feeling a little bit more like this. So your closing slide is going to invite questions from your audience. It's going to provide a visual during any Q&A session that you might have, and it helps you to avoid just ending your presentation really abruptly. So here we go. Let's chat.
Thank you very much, Tracy. That was wonderful. I think at this point, if you would be willing to enter your questions into the chat window, and Tracy will endeavor to answer as many of them as possible. We do need to sign off at noon, but I will share her email address later on if you're interested in asking any more questions. Thank you.
Right, absolutely. I'm going to open this up a little bit so I can see any comments that people might have. Thank you, Mike Jabot. Okay, question is, you talked about using photographic images. Can you talk about the use of copyright images from the internet? If you are looking at an image that has a copyright attached to it, you absolutely have to have permission to use that. And I think maybe you know that. Maybe you're asking about, do you need to have permission for images that are publicly uploaded? And one of the things that's important to recognize is that a lot of images that are uploaded should be copyrighted, so it really does pay to do your homework. And that is one of the benefits of using stock photos, because you are able to purchase or get from a site that is taking care of copyright. You're able to get an image that is legal for you to use, or Flickr on the Open Commons. Those are there for anybody to use. Okay, with pictures from the web, should we include the source? I think that's related to what it was that I was just talking about. I think it's generally a really good idea. I kept track of where I got my photos, and I did not include all of the source information in this PowerPoint slide, which is something that I should have done, just because I think that's a good idea to give credit where credit is due. It's not always legally required, but I think it is a nice practice. Okay, for those who joined late, can the PowerPoint be sent out to the attendees? I'm happy to send you the PowerPoint. I do want to emphasize one of the things that hopefully came across during the presentation, which is that a good PowerPoint is not very meaningful without the actual verbal content attached to it. So know that, but that said, I'm happy to share the content of this PowerPoint slide. I'm fine with that. Do you have a comment in?
And I did post, one of the things that the association does is archive the webinars that we host on a somewhat monthly basis. So this presentation will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. Okay. All right, so there is a last question, at least the last one for now. It says, isn't there an assumed copyright? Not everything is usable by the public. Is that correct? You know, that is an excellent question, and I do not know the answer to that question. That would be something that if I was going to be, actually probably should check about before we share this widely, right, with our legal office on campus, just to make sure that there are no copyright questions. So thank you for asking that, and we'll look into that. Okay, I don't see any other questions. Thank you for the thank yous. And should we give another minute? Yeah, I guess we can wait another minute if anybody has any other questions. Otherwise, good day, and thank you very much for attending. Tracy and I will stick around for another 5 minutes or so.
Also, just wanted to make mention that although we have this recording going to YouTube, it also be placed on the New USA Jazz Association website.
Okay. All right, so for those of you still here, there was a question, do you try to create a catchy title for my presentations? I generally try to create something that is at least interesting or creative. The one for this specific presentation, I can't say the primary title was actually that creative, but I try to do that in the subtitle. I think that's also influenced by the field that you're in. In my field, you can be creative as you want to. Some fields are a little more traditional, so you want to check what the norm is in your field for sure. Okay, I have seen. Okay, somebody says, have you seen, or I have seen great presentations with no PowerPoint or any slides of any sort. What are your thoughts on that? Absolutely. I have seen those as well. And it really is going to depend on the content, the speaker and the speaker's abilities, potentially their confidence. It's going to depend on the familiarity of the audience with the content that's being discussed. When you have a lot of information to convey that is potentially complex, you're talking about relationships between concepts, especially if we're talking about abstract concepts. I think that any sort of presentation software is going to allow you to emphasize those, strengthen the information that you're trying to get across, because you can visually represent a lot of those relationships much more effectively than you can do it through just the one channel of verbal. If you're using some sort of a presentation tool, you have both the people's ability to hear what is being said, but also to see those connections created, which helps tremendously. All right, I will, as Ann said, I'll hang out for another couple minutes if anyone has any other comments, but thank you very much for those of you who've attended, and I appreciate your questions and your comments and your participation in the polls. Take care. It shows when somebody's writing. Yeah. Oh, somebody is typing. Thank you. Okay.
Right. Garvis, I think we're going. Okay. Yeah, I think we're going to sign off on our end.
Yes, that's great. Thank you very much for a great presentation.
Thank you, Garvis. We'll be in touch.
Thanks so much for your help, Garvis.
Oh, most welcome. Have a great day.
Thanks, you as well. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.